Wow, so I didn't think that I was actually ever going to learn so much from anime, but here we are, and I now feel like I could study a PhD in physics and chemistry and get 100%, because that's what Dr. Stone's all about. It's about teaching you stuff. Well, no, there is plenty more than that, but that is something I got out of it, is plenty of science and really, really cool stuff. This is an anime that is unlike any I've ever seen. Let's get straight into the review. Get excited. So what is Dr. Stone about? Well, you've got this very, very talented high school scientist or science student called Ishigami Senku, and he's got his sort of less clever friend and all of that going on. He's got a few friends at the school, but he is basically a science genius, and I do not use that word lightly, but he really, really is a science genius. He knows pretty much all there is to know about science, and one day, inexplicably, basically everything in the whole world gets turned into stone, and civilization completely collapses because there's no one to maintain the buildings and the electricity and so on and so forth. And Senku takes it upon himself to try and advance humanity with the power of science, and he's going to need a lot of science not only to survive but to advance technology to the point of where they exactly were when the disaster struck. And that is basically the premise of Dr. Stone. And like I said, you actually learn a lot about science, and this isn't sort of made up nonsense. This is real stuff he's teaching you about. Now, I don't know how exactly useful it is unless, like I said, you're studying for a PhD or the world does inexplicably turn into stone and all life basically disappears. I mean, that could happen, but pretty unlikely. But still, it's really cool, and I actually did learn some stuff, and actually it's quite amusing because every now and then, well actually at the end of every episode there's a warning saying, don't try and replicate anything that's happened in this episode unless you are, trained and you've got proper permission, because you literally could blow up stuff, and, if he's making, for example, gunpowder, you could make gunpowder the way he makes it, and that's quite dangerous, and if you don't do it right, then you could die. So, yeah, don't do anything that he does in Dr. Stone unless it's really, really basic stuff. It is interesting to know how things are made, how we discovered certain things, and also some really cool tips on basically how to survive if you're on a desert island. So there you go, that's a little bit useful. How much of it I can actually remember? Probably not a whole lot, because it really is information overload sometimes at times, and the only character that seems to understand it is Senku himself. A lot of the other characters are like, I have no idea what's going on, but I'm going to kind of go with the flow, and that's what I would be like, because science isn't my thing particularly. It's like, this is the kind of stuff that should be shown in schools. Like, this is education but entertaining. Now let's talk about my enjoyment of the show. I would say that the beginning very, very much caught my interest. I thought this is something very new. I hadn't seen the kind of thing before. I thought the characters were funny and entertaining, and it was very interesting watching Senku just try and survive at the early stages through the power of science. What I would say with Dr. Stone, and this isn't necessarily a major criticism, and maybe I'm the only one that thought this, at points in the middle, it didn't maintain my interest to the same height that it always did, and in the spoiler section of this video, I will discuss the bit in particular that didn't particularly capture my interest. The bits where it was go, 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 the science, that kind of thing, the really sort of dynamic aspects of Senku's existence, I really, really enjoyed. But like I said, there were bits in the middle, there was one or two arcs that didn't quite capture my interest as much, but the beginning and end were very, very good. And overall, I would say I did quite enjoy this anime. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a masterpiece or anything like that. It isn't hugely the kind of thing I'd normally watch, although I don't really know particularly how to describe it and what kind of audience would specifically like to watch it, but it has certainly got a following, and I'm very glad I watched it. Well, let's talk about the characters. Now, the characters are an interesting bunch. There's quite a diverse range of characters, and I thought that was pretty cool. My absolute favourite, well, I really like Senku. Obviously, Senku's great, but my favourite is Asagiri Gen, or something like that. Basically, the mentalist. He was a really great character. I thought he was really cool and really badass. And this is something I quite like about Dr. Stone, is that a lot of, with Senku I'm talking about in particular, a lot of protagonists in anime and also in various other shows and whatever, try and solve problems with brute force or fighting and so on. And this was all about sort of outwitting the opponent and using the power of science, which is something quite new, to sort of outwit his enemies and survive in this sort of harsh environment. That was really cool and quite different about this anime, is that it was about intelligence versus brute force, and which is better in a sort of survival situation. And the Mentalist had some very interesting ways of surviving. You never really quite knew where he was at, what he was thinking, but he's actually strangely intelligent in a weird kind of way. A very interesting character, and I think definitely the most deep and interesting character by far in Dr. Stone is Gen, the Mentalist. And I thought the character designs were quite cool. Now, I'll talk about the females in a minute, but let's just talk about the characters in general. As I say, they all look quite different. You know, even Senku's hair, which has been compared to celery, I think, on the internet, but the sort of spiky white and green hair is very memorable. I mean, that sort of character design is very memorable. Like I said, the Mentalist has got a very memorable character design. Even the old man, who's kind of the blacksmith or whatever, has a very sort of unique appearance to him. Something that did kind of, I suppose, draw me out of the whole sort of realism of things and just was a little bit strange, and this has kind of become a meme on the internet, was the women, in particular Kahaku and her sister, and particularly the eyes. Yeah, there have been quite a few memes. I might put one on the screen right now because it's quite funny. Yeah, their eyes are weirdly far apart. Now, there has been a theory that this is maybe the product of various generations worth of incest, which is actually a theory I quite like. But also, sometimes there are scenes that are meant to be serious, and there is plenty of comedy in this anime, don't get me wrong. But a scene that's meant to be serious, and I was totally drawn out of it just because I thought, you look so stupid. Yeah, the eyes on the female characters is just a little bit strange. And it's an interesting character design. It's one I won't forget for a while, but maybe just tone it down a little bit because I couldn't take it seriously all the time. It seems like I'm being quite critical of Dr. Stone, but I had a perfectly good time watching it. So I just thought I would try and discuss a sort of more balanced view of what I thought about Dr. Stone. That's pretty much all I've got to say for the non-spoiler section. There are stuff I'm going to talk about in the spoiler section, but obviously that's going to give away part of the plot. It's going to give away things that I liked and also disliked about the show. No major criticisms. There's plenty that I did like, indeed, but I need to discuss that in more detail. So if you haven't seen Dr. Stone, if you don't want to be spoilt by any plot details, then probably stop watching here. If not, I'll be back in a few seconds and we can discuss some details. So let's talk about the bits that I kind of lost interest in. And the main bit, and this might be a bit that a lot of people liked. I think a lot of people did like it because maybe it gave more depth and backstory to Senku's character. But I'm not a huge fan of backstory in general. I don't mind a bit of backstory every now and then when appropriate, but dedicating 2 or 3 episodes of backstory to something is something that will very quickly make me lose interest. And that's what happened in Dr. Stone. Though it only lasted for about 3 or 4 episodes. And that was the bit regarding Senku's dad and how they got there. And I get that it was kind of important because it was how the village came into existence, was a result of what Senku's dad did. And them being in space and being essentially the only humans alive and all that. I get that. I just don't think it deserved the amount of time it got given. I think maybe an episode could have explained all of that, but it was sort of, for me, it was dragged out a little bit too long, and for something I wasn't particularly interested in. Bear in mind, it wasn't just backstory about Senku, which was a character that I was invested in because I'd spent 20 odd episodes watching him. It was Senku's dad, a character who had only just been introduced and was only introduced through the backstory. So it was a backstory of characters that were no longer alive and we'll never see in the anime again. I just thought that was a little bit strange, and as I say, I didn't hate it because I think that it was thematically and plot-wise was important. I also think it maybe some people would find it fairly emotional. It didn't particularly tug at my heartstrings personally, but maybe that's me being a curmudgeonly old bastard, I don't know. Personally, I think there was a little bit too much backstory for my liking of characters that I wasn't particularly interested in anyway, and I didn't think it needed to be dragged out for quite as long. That was the main bit I lost interest in, but once they got back to fighting Tsukasa, the bit where it was sort of, let's go, there's a race against time, that was really cool. And I got straight back into it once it was once it was against Tsukasa. I also want to talk about Tsukasa in a little bit more detail. I'm not saying that I disliked his character, but I think he could have been a lot better. Now, I won't take full credit for this. I haven't actually watched the full video, but I know somebody's made a video comparing Tsukasa to Light Yagami from Death Note. So I'll try and find that and link it in the description if I can. But the interesting thing about Tsukasa is he develops a god complex pretty much straight away, but for almost no reason. Now, I get that he is the physically strongest person on the planet because there's not many people and he's pretty strong anyway. He sure as hell is stronger than Senku, who's very physically weak. It's never properly explained why he has a desperate desire to halt science. And I get that he blames science for a lot of things, but for example, why would you want to halt the advancement of medicine? His argument is very, very flawed in my opinion. And I get science has done a lot of bad things. It's created the nuclear bomb, it's created guns, it's created technology that we are becoming slaves to. I think that's a very strong argument. But trying to halt stuff like medicine and to create this sort of anarchistic way of living where people just basically, he's got a bunch of meatheads, a bunch of idiots who are strong, who just like to fight all the time amongst themselves, and it's complete carnage. And also he's prepared to employ people like the mentalist and also his generals at the end and that woman who wears pink, who are also quite clever. There seems to be contradictions and flaws in his plan. I don't understand his hatred for Senku, especially as Senku and science, incidentally, brought him back to life. It's like he likes to use science when it suits him, but he also has a hatred of it at the same time. And I think the difference between a very well-fleshed character like Yagami Light, who doesn't just develop a god complex out of nowhere, but is sort of forced to because he's given an immense amount of power, and the difference between Tsukasa, who kind of has a god complex just to advance the plot and just to be a antagonist. Light Yagami's character and his motives are developed a lot more than Tsukasa, and because we don't see Tsukasa a whole lot, he's also his development is sort of stunted in terms of his character development, whereas like Yagami, we're literally in his head every single episode, and we begin to understand and even maybe sympathise with the terrible things he's doing, even though maybe we shouldn't. But Tsukasa, I didn't think he was a particularly engaging character in the sense that I felt no sympathy for him. He was purely the prototypical villain, and I was very much on Senku's side. I think they wanted it to be a kind of thing where it was, actually, is Senku the good guy, or is he trying to bring humanity back to a point where there's a load of hedonism and there's a lot of evil and bad technology like nuclear bombs? Or maybe Tsukasa's way is better living, but because they don't explore Tsukasa's argument enough for it to actually be viable, you really can't sympathise with Senku at all, and he is really just the prototypical villain. And I think that's a little bit disappointing. Hopefully, in Season 2, we will discover more about Tsukasa and his motives. And really, if there needed to be any backstory to anything, rather than Senku's dad, I would rather have seen backstory about Tsukasa. And more interestingly, actually, rather than backstory, which I'm not a huge fan of, I rather would have seen how Tsukasa plans to become the god of this new world, and how he's running his little sort of empire that he's creating. We very much get to see Senku's empire. We don't get to see Tsukasa's empire as much, and I hope that does change in Season 2, because it would make him a more developed and well fleshed out character. Didn't dislike him, just thought he could have been a lot better is all I'm saying. On a more positive note, a scene I loved. There were certain scenes that got me very, very hyped up, and I think that's what I like about Dr. Stone. A scene in particular that really got me out of my seat and I was just loved and I thought it was done so perfectly was the battle scene, and I think it was Kinro, the one with the shorter hair, when he's fighting the big guy in the village, and he isn't fighting properly because his vision is impaired, and the young girl, Suika, I think her name is, throws in the helmet that Senku made, and he gets to see properly, and it's just done so perfectly. The music is absolutely dope. It's just the coolest scene ever. I really, really enjoyed that. It was such a badass scene, so well executed, and everything was just perfect about that. And then he beat the other guy's ass. That was such a great scene. That definitely, for me, was the most memorable scene. There were certainly scenes that I very much enjoyed, and although it seems like I've been quite critical of Dr. Stone, I think that's because I've got a lot of respect for it, and I think that it is good, but it could be a lot deeper. And that's what I want, more depth in Season 2. Hopefully that's what is delivered, but I certainly did enjoy quite a lot of it. So that's all I've got to say about Dr. Stone. I've said quite a lot already, and I'll be back with more anime reviews and analysis very, very soon. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you around.